So let's get started. You already heard that. So equity compensation. It is part and parcel of how technology-based, venture-backed companies attract and retain their employees or their partners, depending on how you characterize that. So at T equals 0, you've got a founder's pie. It's got to be divided up. So that's the division of the equity right then. When you try to recruit somebody, or if you're being recruited, stock options are sort of the pot of gold, the enticement of why somebody should join an early stage high risk company. It's the fact that the stock options that are granted at the time of hiring are ones that could ultimately turn into millions or tens of millions of dollars. If you were thinking of getting hired by such a company, you need to know what the offer is, how it compares to the total cap of the company, and how meaningful are the stock options that you've been proposed. And then stock options are part of the standard sort of compensation process within a company that does annual reviews. There's probably a salary adjustment and potentially additional stock options that are granted at that time. So I think you can appreciate these are all fairly important aspects of an early stage company, and they require, they need to be met. So let's start with the founder's pie. As I said to somebody this morning, if you're a first-time entrepreneur, you've got a couple of things that are sort of unfair because you have to make decisions at time equals 0 that you probably didn't even know existed. The two of them are, what kind of legal structure are you going to be? Are you going to be a sole proprietorship, a partnership, C Corp, S Corp, LLC, some other organization? You have to make that decision. And that decision has impact on control features of the company. It has impact on tax consequences within the company. It has to do with tax liability and things like that. So the founders are sitting around and there's 100%. So the question is, how do we break that up? Sometimes there's an obvious leader of the group. So in this case, I'm saying there are 4 founders, one of whom is the leader, the person who's making it all happen. And that founder, in this case, might get 50% of the stock, and the other people would get a portion. That's not too infrequent. Sometimes you take a look at it, there's sort of an obvious pecking order of who's doing what, or who has the most important aspects, second, third, fourth. And so you might end up with a situation like that. More often than not, you divide the pie evenly. And that is justified by looking at it. And if you've never done this before, you look at 100%, and there are 3 other people at the table with you. So the 4 of us are starting this company. So the fair way of doing this is divide 100 by 4, and we each get 25%. That happens in my unscientific study more than half of the time. It is a default that many first-time entrepreneurs get into. The logic sort of makes sense. We're all here. We're all excited. We are all equal in terms of our enthusiasm for this company. Why not? And so the conventional wisdom is take 100, divide it by the number of founders. Each of them get to own a certain percentage of the company. And the problem is conventional wisdom is wrong, number one. And depending upon a lot of factors, it could be fatal. So again, going back to my opening comment, you have to make decisions at time equals zero that you weren't familiar with, didn't appreciate, and weren't able to sort of dig down to understand the importance. So you got two founders. One jumps into the company, works 60-hour weeks, and the other one remains employed. It helps out on nights and weekends. Is 50-50 fair? Company's doing well. One of the founders wants to change the world. The other founder is very happy with the income that the company is producing. Let's say it's driving, $250,000 to each of the founders in terms of profitability. And the one founder says, look, I'm happy with that income. I just want to hold on to it. And I have no interest in conquering the world. How do you resolve that? It wasn't anticipated when the company began that that dichotomy might exist, but quite often it can. And if there's money needed, who provides it and what is the compensation for it? So if those issues could exist with two founders, think about the complexity of the motivations that intermingle and conflict with one another when there are three or more founders. You've got nothing but conflict potential throughout. And if you don't take a look at it before you get started, it's going to be a tough thing to resolve. So the founder's pie is intended to compensate each of the founders based upon what they've contributed to date to get here. And more importantly, what are they going to contribute in the future? What are the expectations? Who's going to do what? How important are those things? And so when you take a look at it, at time equals zero, without fully realizing some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, the contribution of the future is more often than not at time equals zero, but well, we're all going to contribute sort of equally. We all have the same motivations and all of that, but that rarely happens. So one of the ways to look at it is take a look at some of the components of the value of the company. What is it being based on? What's the business? How much industry or domain knowledge do you need? How many contacts do you have? Who's bringing that to bear? Who is taking on risk in the sense that you're a research associate and you get hired in industry at a rate of $180,000 a year plus bonus, and you're being asked to join as a founder a company that may not be able to pay you for 9 months or more. And then who's got the responsibility for making everything happen? What are the responsibilities of each of the individuals with respect to moving the company forward in a material way? getting initial customers, getting development contracts, getting legal work all completed and all of that. So one of the ways we'll take a look at a university spin up. Founder one's the inventor, tenured faculty, internationally renowned. Founder two is a business guy, somebody out of Tepper perhaps, who joins it and brings the business stuff to the table. Founder three is the postdoc who knows how to make things happen. And founder four is the lab tech who happens to be there at the time. And as the whole idea of bringing a company into being became sort of part of the founder group and part of the reason that you get started. And in the absence of other understanding, is treated as a founder. There is no legal definition of founder. There are no legal requirements to treat somebody as a founder or not as a founder. There's no legal precedent as to what a founder means. So it's a term that you apply to a group of people because it's a label that works. But it's just a label. It does not impart any legal elements to it. So if we take a look at this, first pass is how important are each of the components. So in being a university spin out, the idea of the underlying technology is the most important thing. Also, the ability of people to commit to making a company and assuming responsibility for completing the legal work, going out and raising money, putting contracts in place, and all of that. So you take a look at this and a business model is less important than pure startup for a technology company. There's probably a business model or two that your domain already supports. So you're likely to be sort of like that. And it's going to be 2 to 3 years before you're really commercialized. And therefore, the business model per se at this time is less important. So now you take a look at each of the founders. So the inventor, 10. Without the inventor and without that IP, there's really no company. Founder 2 is the MBA who jumps on board. Founder 3, somebody who knows the technology and will contribute and probably is the only person or one of very few people that can actually make the technology do something. Chemical reactions that need to be done under certain circumstances and certain orders. Software that has underlying code that makes something happen that's not obvious. So you take a look at all of that, bring it together, and the scores show up like this. It then says, all right, out of all of these, we've got a total of 321 points. Their distribution is across the bottom. And so this gives you some insight by going through this process of what the relative importance of people might be. This is not the answer. This is to provide you with some insight and guidance in terms of how do you make that decision. So this is saying the business person is the most important. Well, if you were to talk to the tenured faculty member, that tenured faculty member would think that he or she deserves 80%, 90%, because if it weren't for their technology, there's no company. And so for that individual to hear that their piece of the pie is only a third, may come as a shock. But think about it. You're starting a company. If you collectively go through the exercise to drive these numbers, you've revealed personally what you consider to be important. You've heard what your co-founders value or don't value. You've come up with some numbers through a process that makes sense, and it's come out with these kind of results. Gee, I don't like this. Or, wow, I'm going to get 16.5%. Hallelujah. It leads you to a point where you can have an open discussion about your individual perceptions of how these numbers came out. Sort of each square is a bullet point on an agenda of let's set up the founders plan. So you have all of these impressions and beliefs that fall in there, and you can discuss them. And so when you do ultimately massage these results to come up with what you collectively agree, you've done it in the context of, okay, I understand how each of us view things. I understand what role I'm expected to play. And so you're making a conscious decision about the needs of the company longer term, that future contribution. And you're doing it based upon a process that helped you make those decisions. So if you don't go through that process, which many people don't, then what do? Well, typically, if you're in a venture-backed company, the founder shares will be tied to a vesting schedule. And that gets to be a little bit problematic, again, at time equals 0, because what it says is, okay, you own 100 shares today, but guess what? The company has the right to buy back those 100 shares under certain circumstances. If you leave the company, for example, if you don't perform your role, for example, and you get terminated. So if situations like that happen, you have a way of retaining certain founder shares that could be used to replace that person. Sometimes I sort of felt obligated to put this up here because it almost never happens, but it's my aspirations, I guess, of, hey, we divided the pie equally. We now recognize that that wasn't fair. Maybe there's a way we ought to reshuffle the deck in a way that makes sense. And the way that might happen primarily is through distribution of stock options, so that it will change the percentages by virtue of adding those additional shares aligned with the individuals who are involved. Again, that's rare. Again, 9 months after startup, and all of the nerves have been frayed, and the founders aren't talking to one another under any circumstances. It's hard to envision that that might work, but you got to try it. If you've got somebody who needs to leave their role at least, and perhaps leave the company, maybe there's a way to barter. We'll continue your healthcare coverage for 6 months, even though you're leaving the company. We'll put you on a monthly retainer as a consultant. So we'll exchange, in essence, we'll exchange your equity for compensation over time. Can you do something that you can exchange what's left over and get the individual out? One of the things that people do is, well, this is a rather emotional topic. Really don't want to take it on now. The investors will recognize the issues and they'll help us get everything squared away. That is a very foolish posture. The investors are going to come into the company with an arm's length view of what's going on in the company. They'll make individual decisions based upon the employees and what they're doing. And they may not honor any of the agreements that are in place. And their investment will be contingent upon a variety of changes in terms of the equity structure through stock options or terminations or whatever. They will be making decisions based upon what would increase the probability and the valuation of this company moving forward. That's what their view of the world is. And so today you have the view of the world, and it may not be agreeable, but recognizing that if you don't address it now, they will address it later. And it's likely it won't be done in a way that you thought was needed. Also, they may they may not recognize what's going on, and they'll do all those waivers. So the advice is get this resolved before you raise money, because then you at least have a foundation. Another aside is that this is a circumstance where when you look at the legal governance of a company, when you get started, the person who's been chosen as legal counsel sort of is your representative personally, because your goals and the companies are aligned. So setting up the stock option pool and setting up the board structure and all the ins and outs there, what the lawyer helps the company do are things that are done consistent with what the founders believe and want to do. A year down the road, that lawyer is the corporation's lawyer, not your personal attorney. That lawyer is looking out for the corporate entity and what are the right decisions for that? What are the legal issues that come into play? And you can't depend upon the corporate attorney to be looking out for your self-interest. So if this normalizing the founder's pie after the fact is important, is necessary, and is contentious, you may be well advised to get a personal attorney to work on your behalf to protect your interests. If you can't get there, you can threaten to leave. And if you're considered important, that may be adequate to get things resolved. And if things go down this path, if you threaten to leave, you probably ought to be resolved to the fact that you're going to leave. And the reality is, if it gets to that point, this company has more problems than just the founder's pie. This company's got very severe problems. You got to question its longer-term viability. And when you take a look at your personal situation, your opportunity cost of sticking with a company that is injured, fragile, vulnerable, you may be better off of leaving the company and saying, great education, I'll know what to do when I do it again. Okay, so once you've got the founder's pie squared away, then you've got to take a look at how you're going to employ the equity for future. So at the end of the day, and I'm going to be using rules of thumb here. Rules of thumb mean could be anything, but sort of more often than not, it falls within a certain range. When the day is done, when a company gets to the point where it has achieved a point of liquidity, been able to be acquired or has gone public, and the investors are able to extract their return on investment, at that time, the founders and management are likely to own 1/5 to 1/3 of the company. So when you're thinking about your personal situation and you're thinking about the management team, keep in mind that ultimately, through a couple of rounds of investment, your percent is going to decline significantly, most likely, but the focus needs to be on the value that's being built. So the way this is set up is you set up a stock option pool. Stock option pool typically in the 10 to 25% range of the total equity. And it's set up so that there are sufficient stock options available to attract the type of people you want to join your business. You want to get A players and provide them with a prospect of a pot of gold that is very significant. And the percent of the stock options is how that's determined. And the thing is, if you ever walk through a cap table, I think I have one coming up that I'll show you. The thing is, with that, each round of investment, you're adding new shares to the company. The investors are buying new shares. So if there were 1 million shares today, after the investors come on, there might be 1,250,000 shares. And the stock option pool will decline on a percentage basis because you've already granted options, and because more shares are added to the share base, the existing percentage goes down. So more often than not, those stock option pools are replenished to some degree to be able to provide those incentives moving forward. Stock options. A stock option is not stock, so don't confuse the two. Stock is ownership of the company. A stock option is the opportunity to purchase equity on terms that are established. So a stock option is the right to buy a share of stock sometime in the future at a price that's determined today. At the time of the grant, that's the price that in the future, if the price were $1 a share today, that's your exercise price. That's what you would be paying in the future to own the stock. And it will have a defined length of time, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. In venture-backed companies, 2 or 5 years are more the norm. So 50,000 options, dollar exercise price. It's acquired in 5 years, $10 a share. It costs $50,000 to buy the shares. You receive $500,000 for selling those shares. And so you've got a gain of $450,000. And because of the way tax laws are written, that whole gain is subject to ordinary income on your tax return. So it's not inconsequential with regard to the exposure to the tax consequences. How many options? I offer you 5,000 options. Your first question is got to be, how much stock is outstanding? What's the fully diluted capitalization of the company? Because if there are 10,000 shares outstanding or fully diluted, that 5,000 options is half of the company. But if there are 10 million shares outstanding, that's only 0.05%. So the number of options that you would offer to somebody, or if you were thinking of joining this company, the number of options has no meaning without knowing the fully diluted share base of the company. And you are within your rights of asking that question if you're receiving that opportunity of what's the total share base? How meaningful are those options that you've provided me? Now, one of the things that you probably will see or heard, this is why a typical company that I've been discussing, technology startup, probably has either high 7 figures or low 8 figures numbers of shares outstanding, 9 million to 15 million shares. And if you originally started with 5,000, you would get a 10-for-1 or 20-for-1. It sounds a lot more impressive to say, I received 100,000 stock options. If you have family members that you've got to justify why you're joining this company, and you say 100,000 stock options. Sounds impressive. Sounds meaningful. Whether it is impressive or is meaningful is only known if you know how many shares are outstanding. But it's a lot easier to talk about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of stock options than units of stock options. Okay. Vesting. Vesting is the mechanism by which stock options become real, I guess. So what happens is you're granted options, but those options are not yours to own outright based upon a vesting schedule. So you don't own them. You're going to own them as time progresses, and that by managing it in that way, you're encouraging the people to stay with the company and not leave because you have a vesting event coming up where X number of stock options are going to become yours. A typical vesting schedule would be 25% on the first anniversary. And that's called a cliff investing. So they've been earned through the first 12 months, but you only actually receive them in a lump on the first anniversary, 25%. And then the balance is vested at the rate of 1/36 per month for the next 3 years. So that means over a period of 4 years, you will earn all the stock options that you were granted at the initiating date. Again, the hope being that you will be tethered to the company in a way in anticipation of that vesting schedule working on your behalf. And if you've received additional stock options as part of your compensation or whatever, they will be vesting it the same way. So you sort of will end up with a waterfall circumstance where the number of shares or the options that will be vesting in the near future are meaningful. Okay, lump sum, that's what a cliff vest is. The thing is that if you think about it, it says you're on probation for the first year of your employment. If I were to terminate you on the 364th day, you would have no vested options. So you're incented to be a really good employee so that you make that first anniversary. All right, talked about the tethering. And if the company is acquired while you still are vesting your options will be converted into stock options of the acquiring company on a comparable basis. So the value will stay in place, but still you won't own those options until the time clock has worked its way through. And that's part of the reason why in an acquisition, an acquirer is in large part buying the people of the company. The people of the company that have the knowledge, have the brain power, have been involved. What makes the company worthwhile is what the people can do. So if I'm acquiring a company, I want the existing employees as much as possible to stay with the company post-acquisition. And the vesting schedule is part of what allows that to happen. There could also be all sorts of other things that might happen at that event. There may be incremental stock options created and granted at that time or whatever. Okay, so you probably have heard about the small piece of a large pie. And that goes back to my early comment about the fact that percentage ownership of the company is going to decline over time as new money comes in and additional stock options are created. But if the share price is increasing, that's good. So you can't read this. Allison will send it out to you or whatever. But this talks about a company that's going from, oops. It started as a seed round, as an A round, B round. This is done at $6 a share, 11 1/4, $21 a share, $108 a share. So you see the share price is increasing throughout. Well, the founder goes from 100% to 30%, 11 1/4% to 7.27 to 5.81%. So the founder's percent ownership of the company has gone all the way from 100 to 5.8%. Wow, that's ugly. But that 5.8% is worth $11 million. So that's the whole issue of if you're building value on a round-to-round basis, the value of your equity is going up at the same rate. And the exit is out there where the opportunity for you to get tens of millions of dollars is a possibility. So do not reject an offer solely because your percent ownership is going to decline. Make sure you understand what the overall value of the company is and thereby what the value of your shareholdings might be, such that if you end up with 6% of the company and $12 million, are you a happy camper? I don't know the answer to that, and you have to make that decision. But that's a consequence of bringing on additional investors. Okay, you're going out and you need to hire one person. And these are key people. And therefore, they are going to command a certain percentage of the company in terms of stock options. So if the company has made it to a certain point that let's say the technical founder was the CEO and the company has evolved to the point where the business issues outweigh the technical issues in terms of the evolution of the company or its growth or building value, it would not be unusual for a CEO founder to become chief technology officer and chairman of the board of directors. That takes care partially of ego issues of bringing in a new CEO. And if the CEO is being brought on board because it's anticipated that that individual can be successful in raising money for the company because she's done it before, that person's going to come on board in an 8 to 12% range. In the same situation where the technical CEO ego is so involved with the title that getting that person to do a lateral move is difficult, if not impossible, then it's quite probable that you'll bring in a president, somebody run the business. And that person be in the 4 to 8% range. Again, the thought being the technical CEO is great at technologies, he's not so good at business, understanding the complexity of some of the aspects of business and other kind of things. Usually at the C level, there are 1 or 2 key positions that need to be filled with all-stars based upon the nature of the company, the skill set of the CEO, COO, and all of that. In a software company, for example, from a university spin out, one of my first hires as advice would be a VP of engineering. And the reason I want a VP of engineering is that the initial staffing is going to be drawn from the students who worked for that professor, and they've worked on technology on an R&D basis, and university-based researchers are notorious for not paying attention to time schedules and not paying attention to dollars. And if you're running a business, you need to be able to run the development along both those dimensions. And so you'd bring on board a VP of engineering. You would decide who of the existing engineering development team can operate in the business type environment and who belong in RMD, and then staff accordingly. So of those two players, you're talking about people that will come on board, say in the 2 to 3.5% range. The other people at that level are going to come on board at 1 to 2.5%. And the CFO, unless there are financial complexities in the business itself, CFO is going to come on board for 0.5 to 1%. Directors typically get 0.5 to 1% of the company, vesting according to the schedule. Advisors are 1/4 to 1/2. Directors have legal responsibilities. Directors have fiduciary exposure, meaning if things were to go really bad, people might sue members of the board for those activities. And the board member doesn't really want to be sued, obviously. And therefore, that risk in and of itself provides enough of a justification for a slightly higher. Advisors are largely discounted by sophisticated investors because over time, advisors have largely been window dressing. They're people that have great pedigrees and look wonderful, but then with an investor does some due diligence and checks them out, finds out that that person hasn't been engaged with the company in any meaningful way, and is not an element for the investor to be concerned about or to value. I talked about the founder vesting. One of the deltas that I've got here is the question of, in some cases, I'll do a deal where I will give the founders 25% vesting at the closing of the deal, depending upon the scope and the effort that has been undertaken to get to this point. If they've done yeoman service, if the company is fairly advanced on a bootstrap nature, I might give them 25%, recognizing their contribution to date, and then the balance would occur over a 3-year period, 136 per month. Acceleration. When a company gets to a liquidity event, it's acquired, it goes public. A case could be made that everybody ought to get all of their options vested automatically. Because we've all been in the harness together to achieve this outcome. The outcome's been achieved. We all deserve to be rewarded accordingly. There are some CEOs who truly believe that and allow that. The problem being, if you remember what I said, is if I'm acquiring a company, I want the people of the company to be there. I don't want a bunch of deep-pocketed multi-millionaire engineers sitting around paying no attention to what they're supposed to do. I want hungry people that still want to achieve value. And if I'm acquiring that company, I want those people tethered to the company. And that's why I would not want most of the people in the company to have any acceleration of their stock options. On the other hand, the CEO, maybe the VP of sales, particularly in an acquisition, if an acquisition occurs, it's likely that a number of the functions of your company already exist within the acquirer, and therefore your department in that area is likely to either be absorbed or fired. So, for example, if they have a sales organization, they want to roll you in as a product line extension, they don't need your salespeople. And so taking a look at that, the CEO and one or two of the senior management basically say, look, our job was to provide the investors with a return on investment. We've done that. Therefore, 1/2 of my outstanding vested shares to be vested automatically vest. And the second half of my unvested shares will continue on the regular vesting schedule. And if I were to part ways with the company, the remaining shares would vest as well. Because the remaining shares are really there to hold the founder and key executives to support the transition. You want to introduce the new management or the expanded management to your customers, to your suppliers. You want them to provide a smooth transition so that everything goes well. And that's what that second half of vesting is done. And when it gets to the point where you as a CEO have already accomplished that, then you might as well leave. Or if the acquiring company has you working in the mailroom, if you're not being used productively in your role, you can leave with good reason, which is a legal term that says, I'm leaving because I'm not being used in a capacity that's commensurate with my experience and all of that. I'm not doing anything that's related to facilitating the acquisition. Therefore, I'm free to leave. So you can plot this out on a spreadsheet, think about what you're going to need. Make sure you get professional assistance. If you aren't doing it already, build your network of mentors and advisors. It's critical. Yeah, one of the standard things is when you're dealing with companies that need to raise outside capital, particularly institutional money, they do that as a living. They do deals on a daily basis. They understand the nuances of the deal. You as an entrepreneur, an entrepreneurial team, you might do this 4 or 5 times in your life. The playing field is not even. And you need to supplement yourself with professionals and mentors who know the playing field and can advise you properly. Don't do anything without professional assistance. And there's something else I talked about earlier is this is one of the conundrums of being an early stage entrepreneur. You really want a first-class, experienced lawyer helping you through these activities. But the problem is the really good lawyers cost a lot of money. And so you need to somehow balance those two in order to make sure that a foundation is being created from which the company can grow and thrive. And if you don't do it correctly early, it can be very expensive to correct mistakes down the road, or in some cases, it may even prevent getting a round of investment.